Okay. Well, welcome to our March edition of the Altamisa Center for the Arts reading series. We're thrilled today to have Kaya Oakes with her book, The Defiant Middle, and our opening act, The Ink Sisters. I'm going to introduce Altamisa Center for the Arts. The reading series itself will be self-explanatory. We'll go into a little bit of what today is going to be, and then I will disappear into the Zoom room and leave you to the very able hands of our readers. So the Altamisa Center for the Arts is an interfaith arts and spirituality hub housed within and sponsored by Orinda Community Church. We believe that art is a spiritual act and a human right. We wish to provide a place where people from diverse traditions, artistic practices, and economic realities come together in community. We know that art can bridge the divisions, substantive and arbitrary, that divide us. We come together not only to practice and to teach the arts, but to celebrate and learn from our differences and to foster lively and respectful interdisciplinary dialogues. We seek unity in diversity. So wherever you are on your artistic and your spiritual journeys, whoever you are welcome here. Now, I'm really excited about this reading, and in part because when I was a girl and a young woman, I read myself into existence with the books and poems I loved. But at some point, and much earlier than I expected, women began to disappear from the narrative, women I could look up to. So where do women in middle age and beyond exist in our culture outside those cleverly limiting dichotomies, the virgin and the whore on the one hand, or the lover and the mother on the other hand? As Cynthia Rich says, old women have struggled and still struggle without a history, without a literature, without a politic. The writers featured today, Connie Zump, Kirsten Morgan, and Ginny Hoyle of Ink Sisters Press, and our featured author, Kaya Oakes, are writing women of a certain age, which is to say any age past the age of 40, into literature. And in doing so, giving us a language and creating a world we might all grow into. So today we're going to start with Ink Sisters Press. They're going to tell us a little bit about this wonderful collection of poems. We'll then go transition into a discussion of Kaya Oakes' book, The Defiant Middle. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. We will answer them. At the end, I'll keep a tight eye on that, and I will also put in useful links as the discussion goes on. But I'm going to put right now the program itself. There's going to be a detailed bios in there, anything you would like to know about our readers. But for now, I'm going to step back. I'm going to hand the microphone, as it is, over to Ink Sisters Press, who will tell us a little bit more about this wonderful anthology. Read us a few poems to get our curiosity going, and then we'll go from there into Kaya Oakes. So thank you for being here. Welcome, and without further ado.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Elizabeth. I want to be part of a church that houses and supports an arts center. What a stunning ministry. My God, you guys are amazing. Hi, I'm Connie Zump. I'm here with Jenny Hoyle and Kirsten Morgan, and together we are Ink Sisters Press. We've just edited the new anthology that Mary referred to. So I've got to plug it a little bit here, An Uncertain Age. This is a book that holds poems from 23 wonderful poets, women over 60, and women with whom we have studied and learned poetry for years, all writing to the art and arc of aging. We're so honored to be asked to join you this evening and to read a few of these poems. We are so proud of our contributors that we'd love to read the entire book to you, but we are not going to do that. For tonight, we wanted to be in keeping with some of the specific themes found in Kaya Oakes' book. And I just got mine the other day, and I'm really excited to start reading it. So we've selected just a few poems that we believe speak to some of the challenges and freedoms that come from disrupting certain assumptions about aging women. So I'm going to open with a poem by Fran Ford. The speaker in this poem is a woman whose experience of self is tender and joyous and rooted in the body. Dance Card by Fran Ford. She won't dance anymore. The slim young woman with the long dark curls kicked up her legs and careened me crazy. She spun me in sacred light. She shook me in holy shade over hardest, sharpest rocks, through scorching air, every way's irresistible wind whipping grit, my eyes streaming, my feet blind, my head out of step, my heart keeping time. She taps my shoulder, the fat, old woman with the coarse gray curls, gently holds out both hands. She knows another rhythm. She knows a softer step. She knows a way to dance me into the longest night.
Thank you, Connie. I'm Ginny Hoyle, and this next poem is also a tribute to remembered life force. Here is Visiting Hours by Madeline Garner. I see a wolf inside my sister, more monstrous in form, all bone, nails, sharp as knives wrapped around my finger, and she, a long, thin stretch of flesh, covered only with a sheet white as opalescent teeth. Out of a wolfing throat, sounds slip, soft as drool, her breath, the odor of death that tells me nothing left of wolf mating or the wild. When blood matted, heart pounding, she pulled back the skin of life. Once upon girl with an unnerving mind, where everything to be known was to her husk and knuckle. I remember her shaking the world until blood and gristle spewed, and she, marrow gorged, was sated. She-wolf, night lover, who roamed under the moon's glass eye, guzzling warm beer and men. Stroking her hair, I tongue, summer's lazy clouds, winged things, elk grazing knee-deep in grasses, all while wishing she were still sharp incisors. Hunter, full of speed, not dying, but dangerously alive. And this poem is a kick-ass challenge. It's a passionate, fully alive cri de coeur. Here is Look at Me by Susan Freiberg. Look at me. Am I losing the word for my body? My bony wishbone twinges, my tick-tock tremors inside my limbs cockeyed. Look at me, won't you? Climbing into or out of a trench, war-torn, unclothed, mouth set. I see nothing close up but the crackle of stars, rivers of wind. Thank you.
And I'm Kirsten Morgan, and apologizing in advance for a voice that kind of went south today, but I'll do my best. This next poem is about looking on the bright side, and it's written by a woman who relentlessly looks on the bright side and greets each day with a smile. The Art of Survival, Gail Ben Ezra. A hullabaloo of early bird calls, repeat, repeat, nudging her awake. No time to wait for coffee to brew. She leaves her faithful walking stick behind the door, stuffs a hank of hemp into her coat pocket, grabs the handle of her largest wicker basket, and armed with stout-built meat and bone scissors, sets out against stiff wind, high-spirited as the holiday school-sprung girl she once was. Undeterred by creak of knees and hips, she limps across the snow-patched meadow, and there, along the fence line, a yellow bedazzling, giant leafless boughs with clusters and clusters of juvenile four-lobed petals jitterbugging in wind and sun. Forsooth, Forsythia, her husband used to whoop, as if each year those finch-bright bringers of spring, this burst of life in dun-thatched earth and winter's unyielding, were his very own hit the jackpot miracle. Greedy, she lops off branch after branch, hardly noting the ache in her shoulders, the spasming of her fingers and thumb. With the hemp, she twines the boughs together and piles them in her basket. Back home, stiff-kneed, she climbs the step stool, pauses to let the dizzy spell pass, and reaches high for Grandma's matte white porcelain jar. She takes her time, arranges, rearranges each arched branch, then places her masterpiece center stage on the kitchen windowsill. Forsooth, Forsythia.
Wonderful. Thank you. To make the invisible visible. Isn't that what writers do all across the world? Kaya Oaks may not remember this, but I remember her as my first teacher at St. Mary's College of California in English 5. She was then a poet at the time and has made a lovely transition to write about all kinds of faith-based, mostly in the Catholic tradition, issues that aren't discussed widely. She's a journalist and the author of several books, including The Nuns Are All Right and Radical Reinvention. She now teaches at UC Berkeley and is a contributing writer for America magazine and speaks on topics related to religion, writing, and feminism from coast to coast and abroad. Her work has received multiple awards with her essays and journalism appearing in The Guardian, Slate, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, and On Being. She was born and raised in Oakland, where she lives now. And I'm thrilled to death that she said yes. When I picked up this book, I don't know, it must have been November, intending to read a chapter, and the night passed. And I just found in here stories of women I needed to hear in order to become more fully myself in whatever spiritual journey I am now encountering. So Kaya, would you be willing to just tell us a little bit about the book and read some, whatever you want to do? You're
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So thanks, Mary, again for inviting me. It's nice to be with you all and to hear your poetry. And I have, as Mary said, a background as a poet from 20 years ago. I decided to write this book prior to the pandemic. I turned 50 in, I can't remember, I'm 51 now. So I turned 50 during the pandemic, and in your late 40s, there's this kind of cultural messaging around turning 50. You know, it's horrible. You're gonna become a withered old crone and no one will care what you say anymore. And you better buy this eye cream and get Botox. So none of that happens. And I happen to have my mother, who's 83, and a couple older sisters in their late 50s who were like, no, that's not what it's like. But I decided that I wanted to unpack the idea of what it means to be a woman in between. So when you're 50 these days, you're neither young nor old. You're neither somebody who's desirable nor undesirable. You're sort of like floating in this liminal space. And as I began to think about it, the pandemic was closing in. And so I sat in this room with Bickert, my teaching assistant back here, who likes to be on camera. That's a cat, not a pillow. And I sat in this room for a year and wrote this book. And then throughout COVID, I've been revising it and now promoting it and doing events for it. So it's been really interesting to talk about what it means to be trapped in between expectations and reality for women, when we are all socially trapped in between expectations of what we'd like to be doing and the reality that the pandemic is still going on, which I think many of us who teach are very aware of these days. So I talked to Mary about this event ahead of time, and I'm just going to read a few pages from the beginning of the book. And then she and I are going to talk about it. I think it's a book that invites conversation. I wrote it to invite conversation rather than to be a narrative that goes from beginning to end, because we know that the expectations of women are not linear and they change over time. And also that the expectations that we put on ourselves change over time. So I'll start with the beginning, and then we'll talk, and then we'll hear some more poetry after that. It starts happening before you realize it, and before you do, the slow grinding erasures have already begun. At church, the young adult group gets mentioned repeatedly, and even though you look around and realize you're one of the youngest people there, you've crossed the mysterious river into no longer being a young adult. You're also very frequently alone in church. Your own generation, the one that was X'd out before it found its own identity, lost interest in Christian thought around the time of Reagan's Shining City on a Hill and Tammy Faye Baker's Mascara. Only one of your fellow born in the 1970s friends takes faith very seriously, and she's a priest, so it's her job. So here you are, still trying. You're too young for the senior celebration of life, but too old for the baseball and beer excursion with a firmly underlined reminder that everyone under 40 is welcome. You're too old to be on social media, but too young to quit. The wrong shape for those genes, but still somehow the wrong shape for the other genes. Too bland to have so many tattoos, but too interesting to stop getting them. Too ambitious to settle for an easy life, but too self-critical to settle into anything for long. Too angry, too crazy, too predictable, too surprising, too smart, too capable. You're a woman, so you are always too much. A younger friend says you, quote unquote, look good for your age, but you're not sure what that means when you watch Big Little Lies and realize Nicole Kidman, 4 years your senior, has perfectly undisturbed luminescent skin like the shimmering surface of a faraway planet, while your own face is forked and pitted. You look for other TV shows, movies, or books about women like you, women who are neither old nor young, neither fat nor thin, neither pretty nor ugly, neither this nor that. And in each of them, the woman is screaming, crying, throwing her phone, frowning in a dressing room, getting divorced, getting cancer, fighting with her children, fighting with her parents, or embarrassing herself every single day. She is, in a word, messy. But what exactly do we expect women to be? In the Catholic tradition, which is the religious and intellectual lens through which I was taught to see the world, the image of Mary as meek, mild, blonde, and white model of female perfection has caused centuries of problems for the vast majority of women who are like nothing like that, including Mary herself. The real Mary, a revolutionary-minded Jewish girl who grew up under the rule of an empire, does not resemble the plaster statues that watched over me in my own girlhood. But I did not meet that Mary until I was well into adulthood, nor did I meet Dorothy Day, Mary Magdalene, Sister Thea Bowman, Polly Murray, Julian of Norwich, Dolores Huerta, or any other potential religious role model who resisted those narrow definitions of Christian womanhood, not until decades after I graduated from Catholic school. The notions about what women should do, think, and feel are entrenched in religion, culture, and history, and remain stubbornly persistent well into this fourth wave of feminism. We're expected to be both nurturing and independent, angry and tranquil, one of the boys, but still feminine enough to be sexually viable. Racism and classism have made the aspirational image of a thin, wealthy white woman normative when it is far from realistic for the vast majority. Women are expected to be fertile, otherwise your body is dismissed as a barren wasteland, but not too fertile, otherwise you're burdening society. Self-sacrificing, but not selfless. Women can cry picturesquely on occasion, but clinical depression and anxiety have to be brushed aside or sublimated because we are always expected to be doing something for someone else. We should love and accept our imperfect bodies, but not gain weight or let ourselves go. We should have a girls' squad, and we should never go anywhere without them, rather than preferring, at least on occasion, to be alone. We can be smart, but not brilliant, impressive, but not intimidating, friendly, but not fawning. To fail to live up to these expectations can be a declaration of defiance, of resistance to categorization, and pushing back against expectations. These kinds of women are also messy because they're agents of change, and change is messy. And yet, like every other woman, we are still expected to clean up the mess. I think I'm going to stop there because it goes on for another 4 pages or so. But that, I think, gives you a good overview of the book. Yeah, we can take it from there.
And please do, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, put it in the chat, or just speak out too. It doesn't need to be a two-person conversation at any stretch. But I did wonder, what freedom did the pandemic offer you to have this particular book? Why was it, do you think, that this particular book emerged at this time? Was there a freedom that isolation offered you that you wouldn't otherwise have had, or how do you explain that?
I think a lot of it was, a lot of us have this dualistic experience of the pandemic. On the one hand, it was very freeing in the sense that didn't have to put on makeup. Like when we first were learning how to do Zoom, it was like, let's all go to the meeting in our pajamas, and that's okay. And so we sort of shed a lot of those superficial trappings of femininity. And then I think it was a challenge also to those of us who are partnered, for our partners to see us in our kind of disheveled real selves. And then also the fact that I wasn't teaching face-to-face was very different. It was very difficult. But I did find that the isolation of not seeing people in person led in some ways to a lot more honesty and a lot more frank conversations with family and with friends, etc. And so while it was lonely and isolating to be apart from people for so long, it also was a time of opportunity to kind of get to know ourselves and one another as women without a lot of the kind of superficial markers of career and looks and ambition that would normally be sending messages to other people about who we are.
And some of the women you've mentioned too, Julian of Norwich in particular, they spent a great deal of their time cloistered and alone, and that they seemed to find a deeper connection to the divine or whatever it was that they were seeking. But the pandemic has not actually offered us the kind of retreat that she has encountered. So what is it that led you to the particular women in this book that spoke to you? And was it that they were subject to the kind of isolation that you were experiencing, and violence in some cases, in the case of Joan Clark?
Yeah, so the book is divided into chapters that are thematic. So it starts with young, and then it goes to old, and then crazy, which I really wanted to write about the fact that women are so often dismissed as crazy, and then barren, and then butch, femme, or other. So gendered expectations, anger, and solitude. It ends in solitude. And I really wanted the book to end with solitude because that's what so many of us were going through. But part of the inspiration for this book is that I used to write essays for the website of the podcast on being. I don't know if any of you listened to that. Krista Tippett was one. I was very lucky to get her as an endorser for this book, and very happy when she said yes to that, because I wrote an essay for her website about 4 or 5 years ago about medieval women as models for us in liminal parts of our lives. So how do people like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Joan of Arc, and others that I write about in the book represent women who were in defiance of expectations in their own time. So in the medieval era, there were women who were writing and creating, and yet they were kind of hidden away from the world, or they were, in the case of Joan of Arc, they were sacrificed for their beliefs. But someone like Julian of Norwich, who was wrote the first book in English by a woman, and was a medieval mystic who spent most of her life living in a small cell that was attached to the side of a church. So she deliberately chose that. And I thought she's such a fascinating figure during the pandemic, because I had always assumed, and was kind of picked up from a lot of the reading I'd done of essays that men had written about her, that she went into the cell because she wanted to direct all her attention into the church. But what I didn't know is that the cell had 2 windows. It had one that faced into the church and one that faced into the village square. And essentially people were constantly coming to the window to ask her for advice or spiritual guidance, or to bring food, or just have a chat. And essentially people like her, who were called anchoresses, so they were anchored to a building. They were like a post office / you remember in the Peanuts cartoons how Lucy would have the psychiatrist's office that was like a cardboard box, right? So Julian, she was, on the one hand, she was facing into the church, she was choosing isolation, but on the other hand, she was facing out into the world. And to me, like Zoom during the pandemic really felt that way, that people were coming to my Zoom, students, friends, whatever. But then I was also looking into Zoom for church, for spiritual sustenance, etc. So some of those women chose deliberately to be isolated, but a lot of the time they were also getting away from a violent husband, a violent father. Some force was driving them to seek isolation.
Any other questions in the audience? I have more, but I don't want to crowd out the voices.
I have a little question about being crazy. I'm older now, but when I was in my 50s, I was a little crazy.
Sure.
So does your book have anything to do much with menopause? Or?
Yeah, so one of the things I write about in the book is that I had a hysterectomy at 48, and I lost all of my junk, as the kids say. And so I went into medical menopause a little earlier than most people. I still have part of one ovary. I don't know how they keep it in there though, because they take everything else, the tubes. Yeah, it's just float. It's like, is it like swimming around and just kind of finding its way around? But I do write about menopause because I feel like there's a taboo against talking about menopause in our society. And I really like the work of Dr. Jen Guntner, who is a doctor, a gynecologist, and she's written a new book called the Menopause Manifesto, which is really good if you have any younger friends or family. It just kind of breaks down a lot of the biological stuff, but what I wasn't prepared for was the psychological side. And so I felt that my doctors did a great job. Surgery went fine. I recovered great. But they didn't tell me about what was going to happen mentally with that shift in estrogen. And so I really wanted to be frank about that in the book, both about hysterectomy, because it's very common, but I had not met anybody my age who had had one. And then it turned out I did know people who had had them, they just didn't feel comfortable talking about it, which tells you something right there. And then also nobody had talked to me about the psychological side effects of estrogen loss. And so they talk to you about hormone replacement, but they don't talk to you, they talk to you about that for physical symptoms, but not for things like depression and anxiety, which we know now are very, very impacted. So yeah, so I do have a number of parts of the book that deal with that. And it's been funny since it came out that a lot of the time when men read the book, they kind of stop reading at that part because they can't handle it, because a frank conversation about hysterectomy is kind of terrifying if you don't know what that's like. But again, I thought that was important to include. So that idea of calling women crazy is often external. It's patriarchal thinking of like women, if you're emotive or expressive, that it's just craziness, right? And that a lot of people in the mental health community are fighting back against that kind of language. And so I also wanted to unpack it for that reason too.
I remember I just cried a lot, things that I never did before or after, so
Yeah.
I felt I fell out of control. So I like the fact that you changed and the name. Thank you.
Thank you.
We do need like a Judy Bloom for 40 and up. Who are we going to read to find those those people?
I've been reading Bossy Pants, and she's extreme. It's a 10-year-old book, but she's extremely frank about everything.
Bossy Pants.
Tina Fey.
Oh, right.
She talks about delivery and not being a nurse and all these things. Anyway, it's along those lines on a slightly different subject, but I love her frankness.
I wonder too about what's it like being a frank speaker and a woman who's speaking within the Catholic Church. I mean, you return to the Catholic Church at a certain point in your life, right? And that's when you seem to start to writing quite subversively and effectively about it. So how did you arrive there?
Well, it's a long story, and you could read one of my other books, which is called Radical Reinvention, if you'd like to hear more about that. I actually just spoke the Sunday before last at First Congregational Church in Berkeley, where I discovered, and the pastor there is a friend of mine who's also a writer, discovered that like 3/4 of that congregation is former Catholics. So I thought that was pretty funny. So being a Catholic and being a progressive person who teaches at Berkeley and has values that you would very much associate with someone who teaches at Berkeley in terms of feminism, has not always been a really perfect fit, but like many people who are very culturally attached to the faith tradition that they grew up in, a lot of the attachment to religion has more to do with the people than the institution. I've always identified more as a California Catholic than a Roman Catholic. When I went to Rome for the first time about 10 years ago, I was, staggered by how beautiful it is. And I have gone back and spent a lot of time there. And but I think of the fact that Italians treat the church like a very charming grandmother. Like they don't always take its advice. They don't always listen to it. And they live, they're very faithful to the idea of the church, but they don't necessarily think of it as a teacher. So I think that that's something many of us in the USA and also experience. But I was mentored from the beginning of my career of writing about religion. I started writing for America Magazine. I was brought on there, which is the Jesuit Review. And so it's a very intellectual take on Catholicism. There's room for debate in that magazine. There's room for different points of view on issues that are hot button issues. So I feel, that I'm comfortable in that. I'm not necessarily comfortable at some churches. I don't like the preaching or the message sometimes. I find problematic, but I just don't go back to those ones. So, and I don't get invited to a lot of Catholic churches to speak. In fact, with this book, I've only done like Protestant churches. I did, yeah. So it's been interesting how that goes. Yeah. I
think the other church you mentioned is also a United Church of Christ, which is Orinda Community Church is as well. So that's interesting. Any other questions within the peanut gallery here? Of course, I have more, but Jocelyn, you're muted. Just
I would be curious to know whether you find women writing poems these days that are faith-based.
Thank you for asking. There are probably more out there than I could remember off the top of my head. If you don't read Image Journal, that is a good place to go because it's a literary journal of arts and culture that has poetry. And Image Journal, yeah. And
I've read, I mean, it's wonderful. So that's kind of why I asked the question. Yeah.
That's the main, I've taught at their workshop. So they have a summer workshop in Santa Fe called the Glen Workshop, and that has a poetry track. And so I'm aware that there are women who are writing in the Christian tradition who write poetry. But again, off the top of my head, I'm of course blanking out. I'm thinking of like Carolyn Forche. And I don't know if she is really like a religious writer, but deeply spiritual, the Ann Carson. I think her work is deep, has a deep spirituality. Yeah, Fanny Howe, of course, thank you for jogging my memory right there. And then people also mentioned Jean Valentine, Elizabeth Robinson, Katie Ford. So there's many names popping up in the chat right now. Also at the Image Workshop, I met a poet named Padraig O'Trauma, who's from Ireland. And Padraig hosts a podcast called Poetry Unbound, and he often does spiritual poetry. It's a great podcast because it's 10 minutes, so it's perfect for when you get to drive somewhere. And he's got this lovely Irish voice, beautiful accent, and he has a lot of poems by women on there. I'll put his name in the chat because it's kind of hard to spell, but the podcast is Poetry Unbound, so I would definitely recommend that. Oh yes, thank you for the link, Mary. His name's Padraig O'Trauma.
Thanks.
You're welcome. There's also Ruminate Literary Magazine, and there's another one called The Curator or The Curator Magazine, I think. I met an editor from that magazine. Yeah, somebody mentioned a chat where the homily was criticizing gay people for the sin of pride. That's a big problem. So I recently did an event with my friend Mike O'Loughlin, who has written a book about AIDS in the Catholic Church. And Mike is a gay Catholic and very out. And he too has struggled to find churches that, feel comfortable to him. But we did the event to promote his book over at Most Holy Redeemer, which is in the Castro in San Francisco, and is known to be probably the most inclusive Catholic church in the Bay Area. Really wonderful music, very welcoming preaching. And so if there are any Catholics or former Catholics who would like to go somewhere that's very similar to a UCC church in some ways, but with mass, with communion and all that stuff, I really recommend that church. I felt very welcome there every time I've gone. And I live very close to St. Columba Church here in Oakland, which is a Black Catholic church that has a gospel choir and a really extraordinary community there of people who really care about the city and who really care about preserving their tradition as Black Catholics. So.
I think it'd be really interesting, given that you're talking about somebody, like women hitting kind of the 50s, to have some of our poets extrapolate like what you're describing into another generation. Because that was, I think, kind of the impetus for this anthology. So I'm sure you can augment what Kaya is saying. So I'm curious to hear from editors and poets as well.
We'd
Great
love to
idea.
hear. Great transition too, right into the anthology.
I think most of us consider ourselves still 50 or maybe 30. It's pretty hard to leave that place behind because we're still there. We're still who we were.
I just totally love that you took the project of getting published into your own hands, and like to create your own permission and your own community just feels so deeply exciting to me.
Well, Elizabeth, I do have to say that the inspiration and impetus for that came from you. Elizabeth was the mentor for the poetry collective that we are all in, the three of us are in various ways a part of. And you were always encouraging us to, when we were moaning and groaning about sending things out and getting them rejected and sending them out again, and you just said, take some agency, publish your own. And we finally listened to you.
And it's been an incredible adventure. And I will say that the three of us have learned so much from each other. It was really very much a shared adventure. And we needed the strengths and courage of each of us at different times and different ways. It was really a wonderful collaboration. But I do want to read, in light of what you said, Elizabeth, on the back of the book, we have a little statement, Ink Sisters Press, about the press. And we studied also with Elizabeth the work of Emily Dickinson. So about the press, 135 years after Emily Dickinson's pen began to scorch the world, it is still the case that 2/3 of published poets are men. Ink Sisters Press is proud to provide a forum for women poets. And we just felt, that this is a book that we could wait till never for someone else to do it. And we love so much the passion and the insight and the wisdom of the women represented in this book. It's been very exciting to do this. And the book is getting little legs and coming to life in ways that just surprise and delight us. The Colorado Library System has selected it as one of their books that any book club in the state can choose this book as a group read, and they will send 12 books to the closest libraries. So it's very validating to see how it is speaking to people and that the voices of the women in this book are being heard.
Do you mind sharing a few more of those poems?
Yes, we will do that. I'm going to launch this section with a poem, the topic of which will be very familiar to hopefully everybody here, I assume I should say everybody here, befriending our aging bodies. This poem is called Housewarming, and it's by Joan Mannheimer, who is here to listen to it today. In my 70th year, I moved into my body. I'd avoided it for a long time, my entire life, afraid of what I might find. Window screens rusted with holes. Who knows what could wriggle through in the night? Fearful the locks would be shoddy, and fearful the locks would hold. Gingerly, I moved in, unpacked. The house wasn't bad, a bit dusty with habit gumming the corners, sun-bleached rugs unraveling at the edges. I knew I had to be careful. This body and me, we had a past. For years, I'd stuffed food down its gullet, shoveled in sugar till its teeth ached and its eyes blurred. Ignoring its pleas for rest, I'd driven it hard like cattle. At first, it seemed my body had lengths of give, but there be dragons, dripping venom everywhere. And now I have warnings flagged in my blood, sudden spikes of reflux at 2 a.m., and a fracture that won't heal, that thick boot dragging a hunk of hip over a knife's edge.
Nailed it.
Yeah. I'm going to continue with a poem written by Susan Bickert, who I believe is also here. And this one makes me think about how aging can be about thinking expansively about who we've been, who we are, who we might be. I am the child grown old by Susan Bickert. I am the child grown old, walking along the gravel path that circles the park. I am the dust kicked up by all the boots that have walked this path and will walk this path. I am the young mother jogging with the stroller, a golden retriever leashed to the handle. I am the rollerblader, the skateboarder, the biker. I am the girl skating on the frozen lake, dancing with the old man in the wool cap. Look, he has set his radio down on the ice, and now we are all waltzing. I am one with the life all around me. I am the soccer player, the volleyball player, the whoops and hollers of winning plays, the sunbathers splayed out on blankets, the couples in the grass reading to one another. I am the proud geese parading their goslings round and round the silver pond. We are one with the sun as it drops slowly from the sky. As the light begins to fade, the revelers pack up their games, fold their blankets, and close their books. The geese disappear into the reeds. The playground empties. One swing still twists and turns in the air. Its chains snap as though someone suddenly leapt off. Here in the dusk among the pine and linden, I am the one who stands on the gravel path. I am the child who set the swing in motion.
And now I'm going to read a poem to close out the planned part of our reading, that is just a glorious reminder that old is bold. This is January 1 by Jocelyn Green, who is also here with us. January 1. O Artemisia, O rue, and all that brings forgetfulness and bliss to this first day of the newest year. Could it be true that all may not be lost, not yet, given new hot pink underwear, lace here and there, a V of geese in clearing air? So we love the way we gave an invitation to these women, and to see what came in and the gradations and just the nuances and layers was very exciting.
You're here.
Well, before we go, I'd like to read another, and this one is by Ginny Hoyle, and it's called Truce. Today, I meet the meadow halfway. It is still holding still, the way an animal surprised hides in plain view. Once I might have chased it, seized it, worried it, the way a dog wants to make a rag doll of a drowned bird. Once I might have tried to take it apart, my toolkit stocked with weapons of mass distraction. Then I was a match in a beetle-felled forest, a tractor that chewed up arid land. Now I let the meadow come to me. From a tall rail fence, I watch 5 gray horses graze. The green gold hour, turning sweet grass into muscle and bone. If I hold still enough, long enough, maybe I will see how the thing is done.
Nice.
Thank you.
And I have
How about this from Connie Zumpf? Emergence and Rot. I see spring arrive with a pale ghost behind her. The tulips and flax flowers didn't survive the last acts of winter that came in May. Off with their heads. Into the compost with brown leaves from fall, eggshells from today. Wither, decay, and maybe next season. The year he died, my father didn't make it to spring. He was gone before crocuses came up through the snow. This morning, his eyes and smile peered back at me from my own silent mirror. I never know where he'll pop up again. I see the persistence of salvia, lavender, thyme, fed by their own past lives. Under these buds tipped by sun, the business of diminishment has already begun. Honeysuckle spreads like creases and veins that twine my own skin. Kernel to flower to seed, promise to breaking apart, emergence to glorious rot, a rendering arc primal as mud on my hands, to rise up, then yield with equal grace to the churn and suck, the dark conditions of the clay. I strip off my gloves, feel layers folded into the moldering muck. I see the dead leavings of each turn and turn, waiting for my time to turn down on my knees under this sun.
And this poem by Kirsten Morgan called Bones and Tangled Twine. They don't tell you about lightness, how each bone thins into lace until floating happens as often as walking. They don't say that your words will detach and drift above your head, visiting with others like old friends over a fence. Mirrors may lie about faces, but you see right through yourself, light no longer, refracted questions in full sun. No more lost days, decades held too tightly like fists full of string. Aging happens, knots loosen and mirrors implode. But how are you to know that everything thought true carries the seed of its own destruction? And that this is good, the last best time you could never imagine.
Well, that was a nice surprise, ladies. Thank you, Mary and Elizabeth. We weren't expecting that.
It was so
You're-
kind of you.
You're very generous in reading everyone else's, but it's a tremendous collection of poems. And I didn't know I needed it until I read it. And I think the same is true of the Defiant Middle. These are books that we need, and then we need also champions for books like this. So I encourage you not only to read, but to shout them out and get them known in the world, because that's how voices last. I would like to thank all of our readers and Kaya Oaks for coming. Well, we're all coming from Zoom land to be here today. We have some wonderful events coming up. I really would like to share with you next week on the 20th. Natalie Bazile will be at Orinda Community Church to give a talk on her new book, We Are All Each Other's Harvest. It's the first annual lecture that Orinda Community Church is offering. There are plenty of in-person seats available, but we will also be streaming the event. Before you go, I will put a link to that in the chat, but I'll also send out a notice for that after the event is over. Please do however you wish. Clap, cheer, give a love in the reactions. Thank our readers and our authors today. And I want to like to thank you for your wonderful presence. And I look forward to many more of these readings and bringing these voices to the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for being not just creatives and writers and poets, but also being agents of each other's work. I think that's true all across the board here. And it's so encouraging to see that kind of community and collaboration emerging. So,
Amen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kaya. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, Mary, and thank you to everybody for being here. It was nice to meet you all.
A real
I'm gonna go
pleasure.
grade some papers now.
Yeah, no, Kaya, I think you set me on this path to writing at some point. So thank you, or damn you, one of the two. I don't know.
I'm happy to reunite, and hopefully I'll see you again soon, Mary.
Yeah,
Take
anytime,
care.
whatever you need, let me know.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And I put the link to the event next week in the chat. So go ahead and check it out if you wish.
yeah, join us.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
I
Important.
met the 100 and she was slightly senile, and my sister said, "How old are you, Mom?" And she immediately said 39.
There you go.
So I echo some of you other people said.
Mary, I'm on your email list, I think, for the center. So I'll get that.
Yeah, I'll send it out.